think, with some of the more populist elements on the right that think that the state really should be the vehicle for pushing a social agenda, or for getting involved in media or the narratives and this kind of thing. And I sort of recoil at that, and I think the Hungarian example is a good one of where that wasn't successful at all.
Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. Topic today is Hungary, and there was just a big election outcome last month. We were recording this podcast on May 5th, 2026. So last month, a big change in Hungary with the election. And so we're going to just learn more about that and lessons that we can learn, especially for our AVC listeners, lessons that we can take away from what happened in Hungary. And I'm going to try really hard in this podcast with my Southern accent to say Hungary and not hungry, because I actually haven't eaten lunch yet. So I'm starting to feel a little bit hungry, actually. So my guest to explain, what happened to us, what happened in Hungary, is Daniel Kochis. He is the senior fellow in the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. And prior to that, he worked 11 years at the Heritage Foundation at its Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Welcome, Daniel Kochis, to the AVC podcast.
Thank you. Really appreciate you having me on today.
All right. And so first, help us understand what was happening in Hungary before the election. Probably a lot of folks have heard about this sort of authoritarian movement happening in Hungary. But there was an election, and the President Orban was defeated, so obviously it was not fully authoritarian. So what was the situation leading up to this election?
Well, you have Hungary, which is a Central European country. It was controlled by the Fidesz party, which was led by Viktor Orban. He was actually the founder of the party in the late 80s. And this really started out as sort of an anti-communist, conservative political party. It for a long time was housed within the European Parliament in the grouping of the European People's Party. So this is the sort of center right. They tend to be oftentimes in control political grouping. They were kicked out a few years ago, and they basically sort of moved more and more to the populist, I think, political end of the spectrum. And the government became very friendly with Russia, with China, tended to try to sit in between the United States, their European counterparts, and those powers. And the biggest complaint I think that people had from them was erosion of the rule of law, corruption, and these are some of the things I think which really that drove the vote that we saw in April. And so for the first time in 16 years, there's a new leader, or going to be officially a new leader in Hungary. So the TISA party, Peter Magyar was the candidate for that party, won the elections. This was elections with huge turnouts. So you're talking 80% a turnout in the country. The TISA party, it translates to Respect and Freedom Party. They won 53% of the popular vote. And because of the way the Hungarian electoral system is aligned at the moment, they won 141 seats of 199 in the parliament, so a supermajority. And so there's huge expectations for them. There are huge challenges for them. But I think for a long time, many people inside Hungary saw Orban as essentially unbeatable. He had won many elections consecutively in the past, and oftentimes at odds where people thought that he would lose. But this time he didn't, and we're going to see in the months ahead how the new government is able to navigate what I think is actually quite a few landmines for them.
Okay, so let's get to those landmines in a second. But first, I wanted to ask about Orban's his sort of connection to the conservative movement here in the U.S. And
Yep.
I'll give you a little bit of background just from my perspective. So, during the Obama administration, I was the politics editor for the Christian Post, which is a conservative evangelical publication. And, I just thought I was curious, kind of like I would get these pitches from Hungary. I was like, why am I getting, like Orban or a public official is coming to DC and was going to speak to like at the Heritage Foundation or something like that and have an event. And so I would be like, oh, okay, I'll send out my reporter to like cover this event. And they would specifically target, send to me as the politics editor, uh, you know, these pitches to come cover what's happening in Hungary. So talk a little like what's going on there. What was happening
Right.
with Hungary and the conservative movement here in the U.S.?
Hungary, like many Central European countries, is a conservative country overall, right? So that there is the left there, but generally speaking, most voters tend to be fairly conservative, and so they believe a bit more in traditional values. This is a heavily Christian country, heavily Catholic country, and I think when you think about sort of the elite in Brussels, that Hungary, I should say, is a member of not only NATO but also the European Union. When you think about the elite there, they tend to be, I think, similar the way that we think about the elite oftentimes in the United States, that they're uh, hostile or at least not overly friendly to sort of more traditional values, traditional views on social issues in particular. And so Hungary, I think, came under sort of the microscope of Brussels for their stance in particular on issues like abortion, on family planning, on I mean, you name it, sort of gay lesbian issues. I mean, any of these sort of more social issues, and they would, but I think the difference was that the Orban government kind of embraced it, right? And they fought pretty actively, I think, against sort of the prevailing narrative and said, well, these are our values and we're going to defend them. And so that tied in, I think, with sort of a movement that, I don't know, almost a renaissance in the sort of conservative movement around social issues here in the United States. And they really started to try to make outreach to connect conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic who were fighting many of the same battles around some of these issues. And so, it was natural that Hungary would reach out to places like the Heritage Foundation or other think tanks or sort of conservative organizations or Christian organizations and try to build those connections. So the Hungarian government over time started funding think tanks and educational institutes. They funded a version of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, held in Budapest, and they tried to sort of make those connections. And so that I think they clearly were successful because not only was Hungary. I mean, Hungary is not a big country either in size or population, but they sort of geopolitically really outkick their coverage in a way, right? That they're people talk about the people know them in a way that they might know a similar country like Slovakia or Slovenia or something, in the sort of similar space. So in that sense, they were really successful, and they had outsized, I think, influence in Brussels because they were willing to sort of pick a lot of these fights, and they clearly, I think, put on sort of the moniker of Christian values and fighting against sort of the liberal elite. And I think that had a certain resonance in the United States for many Christians or conservatives who I think saw the forces against them as being particularly strong, right? And so they built really strong ties not only with conservative institutions, but obviously also with the Trump administration in the first term and in the beginning of the second term as well. So these ties, I think, were there, and but I think that the important thing in my mind to remember is one, Orban in a way sort of became, I think, everything that he once was against.
Hmm.
He was young, he was anti-communist, he was against corruption and entrenched interest and everything like this in 1989. He gave a speech in Budapest commemorating some of the leaders of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. And now he sort of became that entrenched elite that was corrupt and the like. And so the other thing to remember too is that the new leader is not some progressive, right? I mean, he is also a conservative. In fact, he comes from within the Fidesz system. So, Hungary is not necessarily, it's not a tiger that's going to change its stripes overnight. But hopefully, it's a country that will get some better governance and will have more alignment in sort of the decisions around a few key issues, particularly in foreign policy, which are important to Americans.
And explain Orban's relationship with Putin.
So, Hungary is a landlocked country. It's a country which is heavily reliant upon Russia, in particular for energy, natural gas, oil. They have connections with Russia around nuclear. So there's one nuclear reactor in particular, and they're actually building two new nuclear reactors at that site. I think they poured the concrete for it in February. It's been very controversial, but Russia is not a country that has a whole lot of exports which people are interested in, but they do have energy and not just fossil fuels, but also the sort of nuclear knowledge. And so the Hungarians really sort of built up a relationship with them, and they've been very loath to cut ties with the Russians over that. I think that there was some sort of view. I think that at some level, Hungary's leaders sort of bought into the Russian narratives, which I don't think are true at all. That Russia was sort of upholding Christian values and similar, I think, sort of arguments that the Orban government made, and so there was a bit of that as well. And I think that Russia in some ways was sort of a useful foil to be able to use as a sort of bargaining chip against the European Union, which they saw as over here. So you had sort of like, I think in the way that the Orban government saw it, they were sort of playing between the elites in Brussels, the Russians, the Chinese over here, the Americans are sort of somewhere over here as well, and we're trying to sort of extract a maximum benefit for Hungary. So they talked a lot about things that conservatives care about, like sovereignty, right? We're going to protect, Hungarian sovereignty. And so much like a lot of countries are trying to do this now, like the Indians in particular, right? They sort of sit in between. Hungary did that as well. And so Russia in that sense was useful. But Hungary also has issues with some of their neighbors, in particular the Ukrainians under the Orban government. The Orban, campaign had campaign posters around of Zelensky, sort of as a specter, against the Hungarian state, and so, they sort of started to do Russia's bidding internally. They would block sanctions packages. They would block European Union assistance to Ukraine. This isn't American dollars. This is EU funding for weapons for the Ukrainians or for helping their state to stay afloat. And they would sort of stand against that. They would block, if there was a proposal to sanction a Russian individual involved with some, heinous crime, they would block that as well. And in the past, oftentimes they would again use this as a sort of leverage. They would extract some concession, and eventually they would sort of go along with it. But recently there was a 90 billion euro loan which the Orban government was holding up, and then the renewal of the EU sanctions package, which they also were holding up. And so, that in my mind is not in the U.S. interest to see the Russians successful in their land grab and the atrocities that they've committed in Ukraine. And so I think that they were starting to do Russia's bidding, and it became so overt, right? Because you had these reports that recently the Hungarian foreign minister under Orban was passing secret documents to the Russians from EU meetings that he would get them, and then he'd go in the other room and make a phone call to Lavrov. And you had a tape that was released of Orban saying that, offering to the Russians, saying that he would be a mouse for the Russian lion, and so you think about a country which suffered so much under Soviet dominion, right? The Russians came in, they crushed the 1956 uprising, they raped hundreds and thousands of Hungarians, the Soviet troops, all these horrible things, and they kept them under lock and key for decades. A country that suffered so much, to think that their leader would sort of offer that to the Russians now it shows, I think, how far the Orban government had fallen from its initial ideals when he helped co-found Fidesz in the late 80s.
So let's get into why Peter Magyar won this election. So what was his strategy? What was his campaign like?
So, the Fidesz governments changed some of the electoral laws that basically made it very difficult for a fractured opposition to mount a successful challenge, and we saw this in past elections. And so this year you had Peter Magyar. He is relatively young. He's 45. He comes from inside the Fidesz system. He was a longtime Fidesz member until a few years ago, and he joined TISA. He ran a state-owned student loan center for a while. He was a member of European Parliament for TISA after he left. He was in the legal department of the Hungarian Development Bank, so he was within the system. His ex-wife was the former justice minister, again under Orban. And he's center right. I mean, he is I would say a moderate conservative from what we know of him so far. TISA, his current party, now does sit with the EPP, with the European People's Party, center right in European Parliament. So he's sort of, I think, practical in terms of his relationship, what he wants to pursue with the EU, but he is a conservative. And so he was sort of the unified opposition. A lot of the sort of left parties, such as they are, decided not to stand up candidates. They threw their support behind him. And he drew support, I would say, obviously in cities, in urban areas. I think sort of people who tend to be more centrist or even center left. He drew support from disaffected conservative voters in rural areas in particular, but also in cities, in suburbs, who I think in particular were upset about the state of the Hungarian economy, the rampant corruption in Hungary, state of healthcare. So these sort of domestic issues, right? It's like it's the economy stupid, right, from the early 1990s. Like that is what really drove this election. It was the economy. It was the state of some of the services within Hungary. But also, I think, just the corruption, which was, I think, really very much evident. And so he sort of launched his... so I should say that... So there basically, he was the unified opposition. So that was the big difference. He really took... part in sort of retail politics. He visited towns across Hungary for the last number of years, and so he had a lot of touches. His last name translates in English to Hungarian, so it's almost like being Joe America, right? I mean, he's, or like, Nate Patriot or something. Like, he's very, he comes from a line of his godfather was president of Hungary in the early 2000s, so he has sort of like a Hungarian pedigree in some ways that so he comes from inside the system, and I think in a lot of ways that really isn't surprising that the Orban government would be toppled by a former insider. It's probably the only way, and he sort of knew right where the pressure points would be. There was a scandal that sort of allowed him to sort of launch it. He chose it, I should say, as the moment to kind of launch his campaign. That there was a presidential pardon in Hungary of an official who covered up some child abuse within the state system. This was signed off by the Orban government justice minister, who was his ex-wife, who also resigned. The president also resigned because of this, and so this was the moment, I think, that he, I think some of that sort of veneer of the Orban government of protecting families and children and Christian values sort of went away because of this particular scandal. And I think that was the moment that he really sort of started to take fire. And he didn't get too specific. I mean, there were sort of general policies on the TISA platform, but he kind of said, we want to just be a good partner for NATO, for the EU, and use sort of the West, or kind of, returning to ourselves and being sort of a normal country is kind of the moniker of his campaign versus getting too specific. So it allowed, for people, I think, who tended to be sort of centrist or kind of more left of center, they saw it as sort of like, I don't know, European values are going to return that way. And then people conservatives said, well, we're going to have clean government and we're, more efficient government and this kind of thing. So it allowed everybody to kind of impart what they wanted to see out of that. That
Hmm.
could cause some problems right down the road because people are going to be naturally disappointed when that doesn't necessarily come to fruition and everything they want. Um, but I think that everyone in Hungary who thought that the system needed to be changed and didn't think that it was ever really possible recognized that this was probably the best chance, and that this man was going to be the vehicle for doing that. And so maybe they didn't like this or that about him or the party's platform, but they were going to vote for him because he was the person who's going to ultimately end Viktor Orban's control over the government.
So if you're a far left person in Hungary, you're like, hold my nose. I hate this, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. Is that basically the
Well, yeah, I
situation?
think that's right. I think that's right. That it's like this is an improvement over over you're moving more maybe more towards center right versus more of a populist right kind of if nothing else it's his he very much ran on sort of an anti-corruption platform. And so in many ways his ability to deliver on that in particular is going to be, I think, is how he's going to be judged in many ways. Um, and so, there was a scandal a few years ago that there was sort of a Orban family linked zoo that, like on an estate that had all these animals and, it was like a menagerie. And so, Hungary is not a particularly wealthy country. They have, I think, the second lowest average salary in the EU. And so to sort of, I think when the public sort of saw that, and there's many other cases of this where people around Orban or tied to him or whatnot were seen as sort of benefiting personally. I think that also really soured the public mood, and so the left, I have seen some like news stories saying that like this is going to be a whole new Hungary, but I don't see that. I mean this is going to be a conservative government. I think they may be more practical on some issues than the previous government would be, but they're I don't think that they're going to be some sort of like progressive Elizabeth Warren style government in Budapest. I mean that's just not going to happen. So and that's not what the country is. So I think that people on the left should sort of moderate their expectations about that. But I also think that on the right, I mean there's people who liked Orban or thought that he was standing up for Christian values or whatever. They shouldn't also get really hysterical about what this means because I don't think that it's going to be a huge change in a lot of ways on the social issues.
Okay, so one of the big challenges ahead is that he has this really broad coalition that includes people from the left that helped get him elected, and so that's going to be challenging when comes time to govern. Any other? You had mentioned landmines. Any other challenges you
There's a
see or
lot of
difficult?
challenges, right?
Yeah.
There's the anti-corruption issues they're setting up. They're in the process of rejoining the EU Public Prosecutor's Office. This is the office within Brussels that specifically looks at misappropriation or misuse of funds, EU specific funds. They're setting up another Hungarian, basically anti-corruption investigative unit. So this is, I think, this sort of unraveling a lot of where assets linked to the state or siphoning of money around contracts or this kind of thing came from is going to be really a full-time job for the government. I mean, he came in saying that there are, treaties, there are secret government agreements that, classified documents that we didn't have any insight into. And so I think a lot of this is going to be sort of a learning experience for them, kind of seeing where the bodies are buried in sort of rhetorically. And then you have, obviously, there's going to be, I'm sure, prosecutions and trying to put in place institutions and measures that ensure that kind of behavior isn't as isn't allowed to happen or is prosecuted in the future. So that's one landmine. I think the other one is that remember that the Orban government was very antagonistic against with the European Union, and so the European Union basically withheld something like $35 billion in EU funds. This was a mix of like COVID pandemic recovery funds, uh, very heavily subsidized loans for defense. I mean, so a mix of different EU vehicles, and they withheld those funds from Hungary. They also have been fining Hungary for a number of years now over the previous Orban government's refusal to take in migrant quotas. And so they have like a set fine per migrant that you refuse to take in. And so these, I think, are going to be very thorny issues because the country is barely growing. The unemployment is like 4.2%, but youth unemployment is far higher, around 12%. And so the economy is kind of puttering along. And he's going to want to unlock those funds from the EU. But the EU is going to use this as a moment of maximum leverage to try to extract things from a new government finding its footing that wants to show to their people that they can deliver. And so they've already said these are these 27, things that you need to hit, that you need to do in order to get these funds. And everything from sort of rule of law changes to accepting migrants to all these kinds of things. And on many of these, it's going to be very difficult to implement them on the time frame the EU wants. It's going to be it may not be something that the government agrees with. The government's already said that essentially they're going to keep the migration policy of the Orban government, keep a southern border wall. They're not accepting relocated migrants from elsewhere in Europe. So on some of these issues, there's tensions around social issues and some EU court rulings. So I think that is going to be a very tricky thing for the government to navigate. So that's on one hand. So you basically have three. You have all the domestic, I think, mess that they have to clean up. You have their relationship with the EU, which they're trying to mend, but the EU is also going to try to use this to sort of extract some concessions that maybe the government otherwise wouldn't want to make. And then they have their relationship as well with China and Russia. And so there, we talked a bit about their relationship with Russia. I would say that so far it seems that they're going to be a bit pragmatic in that the incoming PM says that he wants to keep importing Russian energy, but that he wants to try to wean away from it. But there's a recognition that they can't do that at the present moment. They're just not in a position. So he wants to sort of keep that relationship. But he is saying that they want to sort of reassess this nuclear reactor and the funding around it and whether or not that was sort of done above board. And he's changed the country's position around many cases around support for Ukraine. They unblocked the loan, the EU loan, and the sanctions package against the Russians. So, and he's been very clear, I think, in his public statements around that that Ukraine was the one who was invaded, that they shouldn't have to give up sovereign territory for peace. I mean, so he's been clear on those issues, but clearly they're also keeping the door open to some relationship with Russia because they feel that they have to. Not really clear where they're going to go on China. That's a whole nother bucket. The Orban government became very close with the Chinese. And it was actually one of the few issues I would say that the Trump administration in the second term was willing to criticize them on, and was putting a lot of pressure on the Orban government before they left office on. But that's another thorny thing that the new government's going to have to sort of figure out what they want to do and untangle some of those ties, which are quite deep now.
So when I look at what's happened in Hungary, I'm looking at it from the perspective of here in the U.S., we see a pro-democracy movement that wants to push back against the authoritarian moves from the Trump administration that goes from center right to far left. I consider AVC part of that on the center right part. So are there lessons that this movement can take away from what happened in Hungary, or are they just two totally different situations?
Well, I think that the Orban government part of what they did was really consolidated control over the media. They used, for instance, like funding. Media there was heavily funded by the government, ad revenue, and they would withhold that against outlets that weren't supportive or more sort of independent. There was consolidation, a heavy consolidation because of that, some of those moves. So basically, the Fidesz and the Orban government was thought to control something around 80% of the media narrative there. But there still were really good independent investigative sites. And so I think that even when you try to control the narrative, if there are things which are obvious, that there's obvious corruption in the country, that things really aren't great, that there aren't, there were hospitals were closing and services were stopping because there weren't enough doctors or, so because they were either leaving the country, there wasn't funding because the funding was being siphoned off. I mean, so there's a whole host of issues, and these are things that people see sort of in their daily lives, and so like don't believe your lying eyes, right? And so I think that control over the media or the narrative only goes so far. So I think as conservative, as a conservative, and as a Christian conservative, I mean, I think that Americans have every right to, and Hungarians and people of the West have every right to expect honest government, and to demand that of their leadership. And so that I think is really sort of a lesson that that we've seen in Hungary, that this man is going to make, I think, a lot of people unhappy because they see in him what they want to see. But if he can bring Hungary back to a country which isn't corrupt anymore, that rule of law is restored, that you can have sort of differing views there and feel that you're at home. I think that that'll be a success. And when you look at Hungary under Orban, so many of the state they really wanted to use the state to succeed in some of the social issues that they wanted. I mean, the great example of this is raising their birth rate, and so, but what we found is that there was some success in this initially, but over the past number of years, it's proven that it's really sort of fallen off. That using sort of state subsidies and ads, state-funded ads, and these kind of things to push up the birth rate, actually, it's declined again.
Hmm.
And one of the more sort of evocative ones was that I think now if you're a woman in Hungary and you have two children, you don't pay income tax for the rest of your life. But there's a sort of a reverse incentive there, right? Because if what you're trying to incentivize, I'm not making a values judgment on this, but if what you're trying to incentivize is women to be home with their kids, then you've given the exact opposite incentive after you've had two kids, because shouldn't you be the one out there making money if you're not going to get taxed on it, right? So I think that, I look at with dismay, I think with some of the more populist elements on the right that think that the state really should be the vehicle for pushing a social agenda, or for getting involved in media or the narratives and this kind of thing. And I sort of recoil at that, and I think the Hungarian example is a good one of where that wasn't successful at all, and it actually sort of bred graft and corruption, and it didn't actually achieve the ends. And so I think that there's probably a lesson somewhere in that as well. But look at Hungary's government under Orban. It really didn't do a whole lot for the United States. They had some legitimate beefs, I think, with the European Union, and I think we've seen the new government has already said that the European Union has its faults, and I think they're going to be willing to fight them on some issues. But this is a government which cozied up to our two greatest adversaries, the Russians and the Chinese, and that is not something which I think we should find acceptable in an ally. And so I hope that some of those decisions that have been taken now over 15 years will be reversed, by the incoming government.
Another possible difference, as I'm thinking about it, is I have a hard time imagining like a center right candidate leading a broad left right coalition here in the U.S. That would be like Adam Kinzinger becoming the Democratic nominee. It's just our system isn't really, yeah.
It's not really set up for that, right? I mean, there was the talk. I think there was like kind of whispers about, like Manchin and Romney running on a unity ticket or something like this, right? And it never materialized. I mean, um, Hungary is a system where, like a lot of European systems, you have so many different political parties which are all kind of, active. Fidesz was kind of the kingmaker for a long time, but the previous elections you had sort of a more broad array of opposition, and they sort of fractured. And they, I think, got to the point where they realized that Peter Magyar could win, and that they were basically all going to sit it out. There was one other party which gained some seats, the Homeland Movement Party, which is like, I think, even more right of center than Fidesz. Um, but basically, everybody sort of sat this thing out. And you find that I just find it very hard to believe that the United States can break out of the sort of two-party paradigm because of financing, because of sort of, people are so I don't know. I look at the polling and the amount of like true independents in the United States is actually, I think, pretty small. Like sometimes when you think about people who say they're independents, they're basically disaffected Democrats or Republicans. So, but they, people tend to vote party line, so there's not. I don't know that there's a lot of room for that. But in Hungary, I think the system in some ways had just become so rotten that people were desperate for a change, and so you had basically former Fidesz members, conservatives, who wanted to vote for another conservative that voted for Peter Magyar because they didn't like whatever the corruption of the positions of the government vis-a-vis Russia or China and the like. And then you had people who were sort of centrist or left of center that said, we're never going to get sort of a candidate who's left of center winning, but this is an improvement. This guy at least can be honest and is going to be sort of more in that direction, I guess, compared to Orban. So yeah, let's vote for him. So I think that's the change. But in the United States, sort of a broad. I mean, it's so hard to believe. It feels like it feels like we're speaking different languages, right? Conservatives and liberals. The idea that you can sort of have like a unity ticket between the two. I mean, I don't know. I'm a little dubious.
Yeah, I hear you. All right. So thank you so much for joining us on the AVC podcast. I'll just let's leave it with one last question for the audience.
Sure.
Is this a big deal for Ukraine?
It is a big deal for Ukraine because I think that it's the Europe has been sort of taking on more and more responsibility and now they shoulder basically all the cost of supporting Ukraine, and so there have been roadblocks, I think, to that, or at least that funding being more regular and they can rely upon it because of Hungary's active blocking of it. So in that sense, it is a big deal for them, but I don't know that it's going to sort of change the trajectory of the war. But I do think it'll make it a little bit easier for them to sort of plan and have more regular funding. So in that sense, yes, I think that it is a big deal, but I think that we should sort of moderate our expectations of it. The other thing to watch out for that's going to be very interesting is Orban is reported to be coming to the United States over the summer. Maybe he stays, maybe he doesn't. But there's a number of Hungarians who are sort of close to the government or family of the government who've been reportedly have been moving assets out of the country to Dubai and kind of things like this, and so are moving their families, some to the United States, and so that's something which could become a political issue here in the United States if some of those folks are given asylum in the U.S. and it's seemed as controversial. So that's something which could bring this back up, I think, into the news in a few months.
Daniel Kochis, find his work at the Husson Institute. Anywhere else they can find you or look for work?
At Dan Kochis, Kochis, on X, and at the Hudson Institute website.
All right. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.